In this video series, we'll delve into the biblical timeline of history. We aim to uncover the significance of important historical dates, such as the creation in 11,013 BC, the flood in 4990 BC, and even the date when God would bring judgment upon the house of God, the churches, as mentioned in 1 Peter 4:17. We'll also explore the date of Judgment Day, which is also alluded to in the same verse. And you might be wondering what the biblical timeline of history is and why it's important to learn. These dates weren't placed in the Bible arbitrarily. They serve a purpose beyond mere knowledge. God always has a reason for concealing truths within the Bible. These essential dates are not explicitly stated in verses, but require meticulous exploration through comparing Scripture with Scripture, the biblical method for revealing truth, mathematical analysis, and ultimately guidance from God's Holy Spirit. So what exactly is the biblical timeline of history? It's a timeline that spans across the Bible, beginning with the first book, Genesis. This timeline then extends into subsequent books and chapters. Why should we invest time in learning about the biblical timeline of history? The answer can be found in Ecclesiastes 8:5. Whoso keepeth the commandment shall feel no evil thing, and a wise man's heart discerneth both time and judgment. To comprehend the current time or season, understanding past biblical events is essential to understand when future events will occur that the Bible is prophesied about.
All right, welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Biblical Timeline of History. I got Brian here again with me, and this is going to be episode, I believe it's 29, and we're just going to continue to go through Christ's lifespan. With some of these episodes, we may kind of deviate a little bit, and it's not necessarily in order, but we're still kind of putting it together. So, but before we do that, I'm actually going to just show a few time paths on the website, and then Brian will take over from there.
And just for the record, being a good Berean means that we're to check these things out ourselves. So after you watch the videos, you should go and check out the website yourself, see if you can verify it for yourself. And you may catch, typos or little mistakes we've made, but also that's what's going to help you learn it better.
Yeah, and also I want to mention that once we finish with this series, and what's in the works is a Roku special where we actually go through the timeline again. So anyone who the kind of the point of this series is we're trying to make the timeline easier for people to understand, because it's, when it's in book form, a lot of people have wondered how the dates were arrived at, and it's not easy for most people to understand the timeline. So that's why we started this series. But I think this would be taking it a step farther, in that we're able to lay it out in a nice video that's got animations, and I think it's going to be even easier to understand than this series. So we're kind of just taking all that information and condensing it into one video. And so that's in the work. So if you kind of feel like you've gone through this series and there's still certain things it may not be easy to understand, we're hoping that with this video that would help. So I just wanted to point that out. And of course, any type of understanding doesn't matter how easy we make it. Ultimately, God has to open one's eyes, but at least as far as how we present it, I think it's going to be much easier for people to grasp. Okay, so again, if you want to find the timeline, you go to ebiblefellowship.org, and you can go on the right here, and you'll see a biblical timeline, or you can scroll down. Depending, if you're on a mobile phone, it's going to be set up in a very similar way. You just hit timeline. Okay. Again, you can hit enter or just scroll down. And one thing I just wanted to show, because Brian's going to take over in a little bit, but I just wanted to show this time path, or a few of them. We've kind of intermittently gone over these, but it just as we learn new information, I put it on the timeline. So So with Abraham, we saw that his time path takes you to 2033. If you take his lifespan of 175, and Chris has talked about this in his studies, he talks about the 42 generations. You have 14 plus 14 plus 14. And I guess I should just pull up that verse. Let me see.
I think it's in Matthew 1.
Matthew 1, yeah. Yeah, so Matthew 1:17, it says, so all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. And from David unto the carrying away into Babylon are 14 generations. And from the carrying away into Babylon unto Christ are 14 generations. Now, when you actually add these all up, it doesn't make sense how they could all be equal. So, you know, we believe that God is teaching that he's hiding something, and that if you take the 14, right, times 3, he's teaching something else spiritually. So 14 times 3 is 42, right? So you could say there are 14 generations from Abraham unto Christ, right? And with that, if you stretch out this time path, you'll see there's exactly 4,200 years from the birth of Abraham all the way until 2033. That's when you replicate his lifespans of 175. And this is something that we pointed out, I think, before, but you'll notice in the Bible, God speaks about a generation. And like it'll say the generation of Noah. If you look that up here, generation. Right here. And Jehovah said unto Noah, come thou and all thy house into the ark, for thee I seen righteousness before me in this generation. So I believe he's referring to the generation of Noah, because Noah's lifespan, he was the patriarch of that time, right? And so we could say the generation of Noah. And then here in Genesis 15:16, but in the fourth generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. And we looked at the fourth generation in regards to the 430 years. And we saw that Levi was the first, Kohath was the second, Amram was the third, and Aaron was the fourth generation. And this is how Mr. Camping understood that with patriarchs that don't overlap, like Adam and Seth, their immediate sons, these aren't immediate sons, and so they're to be viewed as separate generations. And so the generation of Amram didn't live in the generation of Kohath. They're separate generations, but as soon as the generation of Kohath ends, you have the generation of Amram that begins. And so we can understand these to be generations. And so in regards to Abraham, it says there's 14 generations. Well, if you add that up, that's 42, right? And what I thought was interesting is it's not just the 175 that you take and replicate, I believe it was 24 times, that gives you 4,200 years. There's also another way to look at this. There's actually two other ways. And that is if you take the 100. So this is when Abraham begat Isaac. He was 100 years old. And if you take the 100 and you replicate that 42 times, that also gets you to 4,200 generations. Now, I thought that was interesting because 100 is the number for completeness, and there's exactly 42 of these. And I don't know if we could view this each as a generation, but I just thought that was curious. It's the same math. It's just a different way of breaking down 175. So 175 times times 24 equals 4,200, but so does 100 times 42. That also equals 4,200. It's the same exact time path, but it's just a different way of looking at the time path. And I believe the reason why God does this is because he's teaching a different truth, right, with each one. And likewise with the 75, I just realized this the other day, is that you can actually take 75. And what makes 75 significant, I was reading Mr. Camping's Time Has an End book, and he mentioned the significance of when Abraham turned 75 years old. And we learn about that in This is when he leaves Haran. So Genesis 11. So again, it says, now these are the generations. So we see that word generations of Terah. Terah begat Abraham, Nahor, Haran. Haran begat Lot. And then this in verse 28, let's see. No, so in verse 31, we find out that Abraham leaves Ur of the Chaldees and he goes into the land of Canaan. And so Mr. Campion had pointed out the significance of this because the Chaldees, Ur of the Chaldees is the ancient, this is where Babylon originated from, is the Ur of the Chaldees. And we know Babylon is a picture of Satan's kingdom. And so he was teaching that God is teaching from the Bible that Abraham left Babylon, right, or the Chaldees. It's a picture of Satan's kingdom, and he's going into the land of Canaan, which is the promised land. But when this happens, Abraham is 75 years old. And so on the timeline, we can look at a time path of when he's 75 years old, because that was a very significant date. And when you do that, you take the 75, I believe it's 56 times. Let's see. 75. Yeah, so 75 times 56 is also 4,200 years. So again, it's the same exact time path. It's just another way to break it down. And so I think in this case, the 75, and we can break down the 56. I don't know if 56 by itself has any spiritual significance, but we can get into that in a moment. But in other words, if you break the 75 down, it takes you to the same date of 2033. So each one of these does the same thing. And I think in the case of this, we can kind of see perhaps that God is teaching the 75 years is from when Abraham leaves Babylon and goes into the promised land. Well, that's a picture of God's elect coming out of Babylon and entering into heaven. We're learning during this time of judgment that we're coming out of Babylon. The Bible teaches we're to come out of Babylon, you come out of her, my people. And where are we heading? We're heading to the promised land. That's to heaven. And so it makes a lot of sense that this time path would take you to the year of 2033. So I just thought that was interesting and another way to look at this time path.
Also, the number 24, where you read about 4 and 20 elders in the book of Revelation. It appears in Revelation chapter 4, Revelation chapter 5, and Revelation 11 and Revelation 19. And these 24 elders represent all of the elect, as there were 12 tribes of Israel, and there were 12 apostles or 12 disciples. So 12 and 12 adds up to 24. And so that's one of the, I mean, maybe there's a different significance of 24, but that's one of the significances of 24.
Yeah, and it can also be 23. So counting from Abraham's birth. But if you actually start from his death, then instead of counting Abraham's 175, you could just start with this one. Kind of like the idea of counting inclusive versus non-inclusive. And so if you start from his death, you can count, you'll actually get 23 of these. And we know 23 is the number for judgment. So that can also be significant as well. Same thing with Noah. I noticed the same thing. If you look at his time path, we noticed that the 950 replicated 8 times, takes us to 2011, to the year 2011. I noticed that 8 times, if you do it 8 times, it takes you to 2011, but you can also do it 7 times if you start from his death. And 7 and 8 are interesting because 7 is 7,000 year time path. Noah had 7 days to get into the ark, and the number 8 is 8 souls on the ark. So you can kind of see how 7 and 8 would both fit with that. So I think it works both ways. And I actually forgot about this time path. I don't want to, I could go to this because I already finished with Abraham.
Well, going back to the 7 and 8 for a second, there's verses where it says the child is to be circumcised on the 7th day, and there's verses where it says it's to be circumcised on the 8th day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you also have, somebody pointed this out on the Q&A today, you have 7 days, and then the 8th day I think Chris had talked about Judgment Day being the 8th day. And then you also had like Sunday changed. So there's a new Sabbath that became the 8th day, I believe. So I just wanted to mention this with Noah's time path. So we talked about the 950 in previous episodes. And there's also another way to break this down. And that is, this is actually not right. Let me see something here. Okay, here we go. This one's right. I got to fix this on the website. But so Noah, the Bible tells us Noah lived 350 years after the flood. So the flood began right here. And so if you take that 350, Brian had noticed that if you take the 350 and you replicate that, I believe it's 20 times.
Sounds about right.
350 times 20 equals exactly 7,000. And so it's actually the same exact time path that we've discovered, that Mr. Campion had discovered. One day is with the Lord is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is one day. This 7,000 year time path can also be broken up into 350, which is interesting. 350 times 20, it's exactly 7,000. So it's another way to view this time path. And interestingly enough, God lets us know Noah lived 350 years after the flood. So now we can kind of see perhaps why God mentions that, is maybe it's another type of blue piece or evidence from the Bible of 2011. And this is just another way to look at the 7,000 year time path. So I thought that was interesting. Just like what we're doing with Abraham, is, 3 different ways you can view his time path depending on the number breakdown. So you can look at it in chunks of 175 or 75 years or 100. And we're not just trying random numbers. The Bible does highlight these numbers. God lets us know at 75, Abraham's father Terah dies, and he leaves to go to the land of Canaan. So God lets us know about the 75 years. He also highlights the 100 years. This is when Isaac was born. So a very significant milestone. And that kind of takes us to this next time path, and this will be the last one. And that is Jacob. If you look at, so Mr. Campion had pointed out in Time Has an End, the significance of Jacob turning 100, because that's when God changed his name from Jacob to Israel. And so we saw Jacob's life events, how it broke up into these periods of time. So 60 years, he lived 60 years with his parents, and then he fled to his uncle Laban, worked for 7 years, another 7 years, 20 and 6, and this totals 40 years, 7, 7, 20, and 6. So you got 60, you got 40 years. And so at this point, he's 100 years old when he leaves Laban, and he lives outside of, I forget which land he lives in, but he's no longer living with Laban for 30 years, and then he enters Egypt the last 17 years of his life. But we're looking at this point in time. So after he leaves, so Joseph would have been 9 years old at this point, and Jacob would have been 100 years old. So this is when God changed Jacob's name to Israel. And so this is a significant date when Jacob's 100 years old. So if Jacob is born in the year 2007 BC, 100 years later would be 2007 plus 100 is 1907 BC. And so I thought to just take the 100, and this isn't a new time path, because Mr. Camping has pointed out, if you go from Jacob's birth of 2007 and you go 1,000 years later, where do you land in? You land in 1,007. That's when David began to rule. 1,000 years later, Christ was born. 2,000 years later is 1994. You got to add 1 year. And so you can see the 1,000-year pattern actually really starts with Jacob. We've been looking at how we're following the pattern of Christ with King David. And this is something I actually forgot to show last Sunday. Let me just pull that up real fast. So we saw we're following this pattern, right? Where David begins to reign in 1,007. Christ is born 1,000 years later, and 2,000 years later is 1994. One thing I forgot to mention is if you go 1,000 years prior to David reigning, Jacob is born. So he's born in 2007. But the reason why I didn't lay him out here is because we don't find Jacob's life following this pattern like these three do. So it wouldn't make sense to add him here, but it does follow a 4,000-year pattern from when Jacob's born, David reigns, Christ is born, 1994. And so
One thing I will mention, though, we know that Jacob and Esau are twins, and we do know that Esau got married at the age, he married his first wife at the age of 40, and that was a picture of him failing the test.
yeah, but he was age 40, I think, to match. Um, oh, yeah, so, but I think in order to match this pattern, if
It would have to
Jacob
be Jacob,
born,
but I just wanted to mention that just as a side note.
yeah, I actually tried to see if it would fit, to see if, so his birth would fit with this lineup. But then as far as like 29, 2029, and 971, I didn't find anything, or when he died. But yeah, but there was something that's significant that happened when Jacob. It's something to look into to see if maybe there's a pattern. But as far as the time path, I just wanted to show this time path. So this time path right here, what you're seeing is this right here. It's this period of time going 1,000 years earlier. You go 1,000 years, another 1,000, and then 2,000 years. That totals 4,000 years from Jacob's birth to 1994. Now, the reason I laid it out like this in 100-year increments is to highlight, because if we just do 4,000 years, that'll take us from Jacob's birth all the way to 1994, the latter reign. However, if you go in 100-year increments or replications, you'll see what key dates it lands on, right? So if you go 600 years, right, using the 100 years, so this 100 years, Jacob's born to when his name is changed to Israel. At this point, we're at the 600-year mark, and that's when they entered into the promised land, right? So 2007, 600 years later, is 1407. And we know that's the date that right here, 1407, that's when they crossed over the Jordan River. So after being in the wilderness for 40 years, after the Exodus, we're at the promised land. So you can see that this lines up. You drag your mouse exactly at the 600-year mark. You go 800 years, it lands you when Abimelech began to rule. I don't know if that's significant at all. I just pointed it out here. I know Abimelech is the son of Gideon, and Gideon was an elect. I don't know if Abimelech is an elect, but I do know that he also begins to rule as judge, because if we pull down this 360-year period, we'll see right here in the year 1207 BC, that's when Abimelech rules. He only rules for 3 years. Or I don't know if it's a rule or if it's a judge. I guess it's the same thing. So that's that. And then if you go, that's the 800-year mark. And then now we're at the 1,000-year mark. So 100 times 10, that's when David begins to rule. That's significant. And we just talked about that, how 1,000 years later, David rules. And then if you go from David, 1,000 years more, we land on Christ's birth. So that would be 2100s from Jacob's birth to Christ's birth. 100 times 20 is 2,000.
And Christ was born king, so he began to rule the year he was born.
Right. And what's interesting
Whereas
about
unlike David, David wasn't born king, but he became ruler later.
Mhm. And Jacob's a picture of Christ. Now, what's interesting is from Jacob all the way to Christ's birth is 2,000 years. Maybe this is a hint that we should go another 2,000 years, because if you go from when Christ is born, 7 BC, plus 2,000 years, you get to 1993. So start with Jacob, 2007. You go 2,000 years, Christ is born. You go another 2,000 years, 1994. So that's something which is a total of 4,000 years. But if you break it up in that way, I think that's interesting. And then if you keep replicating the 100, eventually this is just another 2,000 years worth of 100s, starting from Christ's birth, and you end up in 1994 AD. Now, I know people have asked, what's the biblical evidence to go 2,000 years from Christ's birth, right? Or even from 2033. And this is just another time path that shows why we could go 2,000 years from Christ's birth, is because you can see this is what the timeline shows when you go from Jacob to Christ. 2,000 years, you can go another 2,000 years. That lands you in 1994. And that's just one time path. We've seen other time paths that have taken us to 1994. We've gone over those before, so I won't go over them now. But I just thought that I should lay this out because I thought that would be good to add. And as time goes on, we'll add more on the timeline. But so far, you can see we have quite a bit added. So we've started with Adam. His 130 years from his birth to when Seth is born is 130. We saw that takes you to 1988, which is exactly the 13,000th year of Earth's history. I thought that was interesting because you can go from the very beginning of time to the very end of time. 1988 marks the beginning of the end, essentially. This is that last period of time. And then Noah's lifespan, we just looked at that. That takes us to 2011. So you got 13,000, which is 1988. You got 2011, which is 13,023. We have the 7,000 year time path of Judgment Day. We also have the 350 that totals to 7,000. So it's another way to look at this time path. We have Abraham, the three different ways of looking at the same exact time path. We saw Ishmael. We don't know too much about this, but it's just interesting to point out that his lifespan does take you to 2029. And we've seen the other time path that we just went over, with lining up King David's rule with Christ's rule with the last 40-year period we've been in since 1994. And so this is something I think worth looking into. And then we just saw with Jacob's time path, you can take 100-year increments. This is some other, Mr. Camping had discovered this time path of the 430 years equating to 1290 3 times. That takes you through all the tribulations. So we're back at 1994. So you can see, look, 1994, 1994. These are all key dates: 2029, 2033, 2011. And you can do the same thing with Moses, well, actually Amram. Amram, I'm not sure the significance of this, but he also takes you to 2033. And he has the same age as Ishmael. So Ishmael takes you to 2029. Amram takes you to 2033. We have Moses, which is a very interesting time path, I think, because if you take his whole lifespan of 120, that gets you to the when Christ was crucified. Now, if you break it up into 40-year increments, which the Bible does for us, and you continue that path all through the Judges period, which we found out is made up of all 40-year periods, you continue that pattern, you'll also get to 7 BC and to 33 AD. And then if you continue that stream of 40s, so you start here, you continue the stream of 40s, you'll get to 1994, and you'll get to 2033. So I like to see this as ever since the birth of Moses, we've been in these 40-year periods of testing. And finally, when we hit 1994, we hit that last period of testing. And what we're learning now is, at the time when Mr. Camping had discovered 1994, he thought that was the end of the world, or possibly it could be the end. That's why he put a question mark. But he didn't fully see what we're seeing, how we're seeing that, no, it starts here, but it doesn't end until 2033. That would be that final 40. We have to finish that 40. And also we saw with Christ's lifespan, we've started this pattern and it completes down here. So, and that's Moses. And finally, we went through the Exodus time path that takes you to Christ's birth. We did the time path from the Promised Land that also takes you to Christ's birth. Again, these are all made up of 40-year increments. There's different ways to look at it. Christ is also, you can also look at it in 50-year increments. Let's see.
50
Yeah,
being the Jubilee.
right. So the 40 could be looked at in the way of testing, but if you go from 1407, negative 1407 plus 50 years times 28, that gets you to 7 BC. So it's 35 periods of 40 if you look at it in that number breakdown. So you can see it as a period of testing, but you can also see it as 50 times 28, which is the same duration of time, but 50 is the number for the Jubilee. And so we can see, just, again, another way to look at this time path, just like with what we saw with Abraham, the three different
Or
ways.
instead of 50 times 28, you could say 50 times 2 times 14, as we see 14, the 14 generations.
Yeah, yep, another way to look at it, yep. And Moses too, you can look at his lifespan of 120, or you can view it in segments of 40. And then the 440 years,
Well, the
which,
reason we can break down Moses into 3 40-year periods is because he spent 40 years as the prince of Egypt. And at the age of 40, that's when he slayed the Egyptian. And then he went out into the wilderness and he married his wife and lived with his father-in-law. And then the last 40 years of his life was after the Exodus when he led the Israelites through the wilderness. That's why we can break that down into 40-year periods.
yeah,
And also, you mentioned that Amram and Ishmael both lived to be 137. I would also point out that Levi died at the age of 137, and also because Isaac was born when Abram was 100 and Sarai was 90. Abram was 10 years older than her. So she's the only woman that we know her death age. She died at age 127, but him being 10 years older, he would have been 137 at the time of her death.
mhm. Yeah, oh, Abraham would have been 137, yep.
Correct.
Yeah, so 137 is definitely highlighted a lot on the timeline, just in the case of Abraham and Ishmael. Levi, we haven't come up with a time path for Levi. I don't think it lands on anything significant. So if you don't see a time path, it's either we haven't put it on the website or it just doesn't lead anywhere. So it doesn't lead on any significant date. Now, I did want to mention something here after I show you this last one is that, and I know it kind of took a while going over this, but I think it's always good to review, is this 440 is of no surprise that it's made up of 40 periods, right? 440 divided by 40, you have 11 40s. And again, it's just part of this stream of 40s here. You start right here. It's just part of this time path here, but it's another way to look at it because God talks about the 440 years, actually 450 about, but we know it's exactly 440 if you start with Moses as the first judge when he's 40 years old. And you go to the end of Samuel, he's the last judge. And that takes you to 2033 as well, if you replicate the 440s. And so again, I think it's highlighting these key dates. I mean, you can just see how many times 2033 is popping up. You have it once, you have it with Moses, you have it with Amram, we see it with Abraham. So that's 4 times right there. And we also see it with, I'd say that time path has popped up probably the most, 2033. We also see it with just the idea of the 3 rules. I mean, of David's reign, of Christ's first coming and his second coming. And then one last thing I want to mention, then I'm going to give it over to Brian, is I haven't laid this time path out yet, but it's just something I thought was pretty interesting. And that is ever since 2011 began, we've been in this period of, we believe will last for 22 years. Because if you take 2011 plus 22 years, if you count inclusive, it's 20, or calendar years, it's 23 years. So that takes you to 2033. Now I thought to see if you take 22-year increments, where does that land? And interestingly enough, if you start from the very beginning of time, from creation. So the Earth was created in 11,013 BC, or year zero, if you follow actually how old the Earth was, right? But we say BC because it's 11,013 years before the Gregorian calendar, right? So if you go 11,013 and you do 22 years times 593, you get to 2033. You got to count calendar years. So that means you count 11,013 as the first year. So basically, from the beginning of time all the way to the end of time, you could say that we've been in periods of 22 years. And so if you start here, 22 years plus 22 years plus 22 years, and you keep on going, finally, when you get to the year 2011, that marks that last 22-year period. So kind of like with the 40s, we're on that last 40-year period. It's possible that we could view the 22 years as being on the last 22-year period. Now, I don't know what the significance of 593 is, but I do know it's a prime number, so it can't be broken down at all. But I just thought that was interesting. And furthermore, it's interesting because this 22-year period doesn't just land on 2033, it actually lands on other significant dates on the timeline. I haven't put it up yet. I'll do that later. And I actually don't remember what they are, but it doesn't just land on 2033, it does land on other dates. So I just thought it was interesting. I'm not saying I have any verses that have led me to do that, but I kind of just worked backwards and just thought that it's pretty interesting how exactly from 11,013 you can do that and it lands you on 2033. So, all right, with that said, I'll give it over to Brian.
Okay. Thank you, Carl.
Yep.
So I want to step back a little bit. 2 sessions ago, Carl, you had mentioned that Camping's analysis of the ages of Levi and Aaron were a little bit different in Time Has an End versus Adam When. I believe his analysis was correct in Adam When, but he wasn't sure later. Also, Bobby Seeby had mentioned it in the panel discussion, which was in Time Has an End, Part 5. Uh, so God did reveal a great many things to Mr. Camping, but often he declares something to be true without fully developing or proving why he believes that. And so when I've been going through Mr. Camping's writings, I've had a policy of trust but verify. And this is something that we all should be doing because that's what it means to be a good Berean. Now, I'm not sure why Mr. Camping changed his position from Adam When to Time Has an End, but I can go over something that I was looking at and that puzzled me, to use a campinism, it puzzled me for a while. And I was looking at the 40-year sojourn in the wilderness. And if we go to, can you guys see the olive tree now?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay. So if we go to Exodus 7:7, we read, and Moses was and a score is 20. So four score would be 4 times 20 or 80. And Moses was fourscore years old, and Aaron fourscore and 3 years old when they spake unto Pharaoh. So this is telling us that Moses and Aaron were 80 and 83, respectively, at the time of the Exodus. We also, if we look at Numbers 33, and we'll look at verse 38. And Aaron the priest went up into Mount Hor at the commandment of Jehovah and died there in the 40th year after the children of Israel were come up out of the land of Egypt in the first day of the 5th month. So Aaron died 40 years after the Exodus on the first day of the 5th month. And if we go to Deuteronomy, um, 1, and we'll read the first 3 verses of the book of Deuteronomy. These be the words which Moses spake unto all Israel on this side Jordan, in the wilderness, in the plain over against the Red Sea, between Paran and Tophel, and Laban, and Hazarath, and Dizadab. There are 11 days' journey from Horeb by way of Mount Seir unto Kadesh Barnea. And it came to pass in the 40th year, in the 11th month, on the first day of the month, that Moses spake unto all the children of Israel according to all that Jehovah had given him commandment unto them. So here again we see Moses speaking to the children of Israel on the first day of the 11th month, 40 years after the Exodus. And if we're going to go down to Deuteronomy, we'll go to 34, which is the last chapter of the book of Deuteronomy, and we'll read the first 7 verses. And Moses went up from the plains of Moab unto the mountain of Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, that is over against Jericho. And Jehovah showed him all the land of Gilead unto Dan, and all Naphtali, and the land of Ephraim, and Manasseh, and the land of Judah, to the utmost sea, and the south, and the plains of the valley of Jericho, the city of the palm trees unto Zoar. And Jehovah said unto him, This is the land which I swear unto Abraham, unto Isaac, and unto Jacob, saying, I will give it unto thy seed. I have caused thee to see it with thine eyes, but thou shalt not go over thither. So Moses, the servant of Jehovah, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of Jehovah. And he buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, over against Beth Peor, but no man knoweth of his sepulchre unto this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was not dim, nor his natural force abated. So I thought, it says that Moses and Aaron, they both died 40 years after the Exodus. And Moses was 120, excuse me, was 80 at the time of the Exodus. He died at the age of 120. And so I thought this had to be 40 years after the Exodus. And if we go to Joshua 4:19, and the people came up out of Jordan on the 10th day of the first month and encamped in Gilgal in the east border of Jericho. So initially, and I was wrong, but initially I thought this must have been the 41st anniversary of when the Passover lamb was selected. And if you want to know when the Passover lamb was selected, that's in Exodus 12, 1 to 5. Exodus 12, 1 to 5. And Jehovah spake unto Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. And this would be either the month Nisan or the month Abib. It shall be unto you the first month of the year. Speak ye unto all the congregation of Israel, saying, In the 10th day of this month they shall take unto them every man a lamb according to the house of their fathers, and lamb for an house. So here, this is the 10th day of the first month. And here again, we read 10th day of the first month. So we know that Moses and Aaron died 40 years after the Exodus, and Moses was 80 at the Exodus and 120 when he died. So I thought, well, this would have had to have been 41 years after this Passover lamb was selected. Um, and in case you're wondering how that would have worked out historically, it would have been uh, Monday, March 16th. And again, this is not correct, but this is what I initially thought. Monday, March 16th, 1406 falls on the 10th day of the first month. But anyway, but we also read in Numbers 14:31 to 33. But your little ones, which ye said should be a prey, I will bring them in, and they shall know the land which ye have despised. But as for your carcasses, they shall fall in this wilderness. And your children shall wander in this wilderness 40 years, and shall bear your whoredoms until your carcasses be wasted in the wilderness. And if we go to Numbers 32:13, we again read, and Jehovah's anger was kindled against Israel, and he made them to wander in the wilderness 40 years until all the generation that had done evil in the sight of Jehovah was consumed. And we know that they departed on the first day of the 15th month. And we can read about that in Numbers 33:3. And they departed from Ramesses in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month, on the morrow after the Passover. The children of Israel went out with an high hand in the sight of all the Egyptians. And we'll go to Exodus 15, and we'll read verses 4, 5, and 22. Exodus 15, verses 4 and 5. Pharaoh's chariots and his host he hath cast into the sea. His chosen captains are also drowned in the Red Sea. The depths have covered them. They sank into the bottom as a stone. And we'll skip down to verse 22. Exodus 15:22. So Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. And we read in Exodus 40, verses 1 to 3. And Moses and Jehovah spake unto Moses, saying, on the first day of the first month thou shalt set up the tabernacle of the tent of the congregation, and thou shalt put therein the ark of the testimony, and the cover the ark with the veil. So we know that the Exodus took place on the 15th day of the first month, and the tabernacle was finished on the first day of the first month the following year. So presumably they would have stayed in one spot while they were building the tabernacle, and that means that they would not have been wandering for that first year after the Exodus. And it made me think of, we've gone over a number of times where the Israelites were in Egypt for a total of 430 years, but they were only oppressed for 400 years, which means that the first 30 years they were not oppressed or afflicted. Okay, and I thought maybe there was a similar situation where they were wandering the wilderness for a total uh, of 40 years, but they were wandering for 40 years, but they were in the wilderness for a total of 41. And that would seem to harmonize with the fact that Moses and Aaron both died after 40 years, and that Moses was 120 when he died versus 80 when the Exodus occurred. And that all seemed to make sense, but the only problem was that means that they would have been in the wilderness 41 years rather than 40, and that would have meant that they entered the promised land in 1406 rather than 1407, and that would have thrown the whole timeline off a year. And again, to use a campingism, I really puzzled over this for a long time, and I really struggled. I couldn't figure this out. But then God made the light bulb go off in my head, and then I realized something. If you go back to Exodus 40, um, again, we'll read verses 1 to 3. And Jehovah spake unto Moses, saying, On the first day of the first month, thou shalt set up the tabernacle of the tent of the congregation. And thou shalt put therein the cover of the ark of the testimony, and cover the ark with a veil. And the key here is down in verse 17. Exodus 40, verse 17. And it came to pass in the first month, in the second year, on the first day of the month, that the tabernacle was reared up. So it turns out that this second year would have been the second calendar year after the Exodus, which would have been the first actual year after the Exodus. And so, because of this, and in case you're wondering when that would be historically, we know that the Exodus took place on the 15th day of the first month, which would have been Saturday, March 27th, 1447 BC. So 1 year later, on the first day of the first month, would have corresponded to Thursday, February 27th, 1446 BC, when the tabernacle would have been reared up. And this would have been the second calendar year, first actual year after the Exodus. And so, if we apply that same logic, we'll say that when Moses and Aaron died, it says 40 years after the Exodus, it was 40 calendar years, 39 actual years. And back, we know that Aaron died on the first day of the fifth month, 40 calendar years, 39 actual years after the Exodus. And that means that Aaron would have died on June 24th. So here, again, going back to Numbers 33, 38. And Aaron the priest went up into the Mount Hor at the commandment of Jehovah and died there in the 40th year. And this would be the 40th calendar year, 39th actual year. In the 40th year after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt on the first day of the fifth month. Aaron was 123 years old when he died in Mount Hor. And so if we go and look at this historically, uh, again, the Exodus was in 1447. 39 actual years later would be 1408. 40 years would be 1407. 39 would be 1408 BC. First day of the fifth month is 1 Av. This would have been Monday, June 24th, 1408 BC. And as far as Moses, he would have died on, I didn't write that down. But anyway, you might be asking, how could Moses and Aaron be 40 years older 39 years later? And the answer is, we know that the Exodus took place on the 15th day of the first month. So that means that on the day of the Exodus, which was this would have been, oh, I'm sorry, 1447. So 15 Nisan, 15th day of the first month, Aaron would have been 83 on this date. And then if you go to 40 years later, change this 1 to a 5, That means on this date, Aaron would have been 39 years older. He would have been 122, and that means he would have had to celebrate his 23rd birthday between the 15th day of the first month and his death date, which was the first day of the fifth month. So too with Moses, he would have been 100. He would have been 119, 39 years after the Exodus, and then his birthday would have had to have been from the 16th day of the first month between that and his death day, which was the first day of the 11th month. And we saw a similar thing where Christ was 12 years old, or 12 and a half years old, 13 years after his birth year when he was in the temple. And so I think Mr. Camping might have had a little bit of trouble distinguishing these, as I did. I think that might have been a cause for why he was a little confused and time has an end.
Okay, thanks, Brian. It is time to start the
You
panel.
have
So,
anything to add to that, Carl?
can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, okay.
So
If we had more time, but it's already 4 o'clock, so we have to start the panel. But we'll pick up next Sunday, and if you just give us a few minutes, we'll start the panel.